What if the moment everyone in the room laughed at you turned out to be the moment that changed everything? Not for you, but for them. If you have ever been looked down on, dismissed, or made to feel small by someone who thought their money made them better than you, then this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with it. And before we go any further, if you are new here, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear a story like this today, and subscribe so you never miss what we put out next. We love hearing from you. So drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Now let us get into it. The morning Margaret Allen walked into the offices of Pennington and Associates, the sky outside was a color of old silver. Not bright, not dark, just the kind of flat, quiet gray that sits over a day when something important is about to happen, and the world has not decided yet whether it will be good or terrible. She was 61 years old. Her coat was clean but thin at the elbows. Her shoes had been polished so carefully you could almost see her reflection in them, which told you everything about who she was. She was not a woman who had much, but she was a woman who took care of what she had. She carried a small brown envelope in both hands, the way you carry something fragile, something that matters. The receptionist smiled at her and pointed her down the hall toward the main conference room. Margaret thanked her softly and walked slowly, her footsteps almost silent on the thick carpet. She had been in this building only once before, many years ago, under very different circumstances. Back then, she had not come to the front door. The conference room smelled of leather and wood polish. A long table ran down the center of it, and at the far end sat Sebastian Croft. He was 34 years old, tanned, and dressed in a suit that cost more than most people made in 3 months. He had his father's jaw and his father's eyes, but none of the things that had made his father worth knowing. He was scrolling through his phone when Margaret entered, and he did not look up right away. When he finally did, his eyes moved over her the way eyes move over furniture. Quickly, without much interest. "Mrs. Allen," he said, not a greeting, more like a confirmation that she was, in fact, present and taking up space. "Mr. Croft," she said, and she sat down across from him, placing the brown envelope gently on the table in front of her. Sebastian glanced at it, then back at his phone. Arthur Pennington came in 2 minutes later. He was 70 years old with white hair and the kind of face that had learned, over decades, to give nothing away. He had been Edmund Croft's personal lawyer for 31 years. He had written the will himself. He knew every line of it. He set his briefcase on the table, opened it without hurry, and removed a thin folder, which he placed face down in front of him. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Sebastian. He folded his hands. "Thank you both for coming," he said. "We are here to carry out the final instructions of Edmund Gerald Croft, who passed 22 days ago. I will read the relevant portions of the will, and then we will address any items that require direct handling." Sebastian put his phone face down on the table. He leaned back in his chair with the comfortable ease of a man who already knew he was the main event. Edmund Croft had built a business empire, worth hundreds of millions. There were properties in 4 countries, investment portfolios, a private art collection, shares in companies Margaret had never heard of. Sebastian had been preparing for this day for years, in the quiet, patient way that certain kinds of sons do. Arthur read through the major items methodically. The primary estate in the north went to Sebastian. The investment portfolio, restructured and distributed between Sebastian and 2 charitable foundations Edmund had supported. The art collection, partially donated to a national museum, the rest to Sebastian. The company's shares, transferred according to a separate legal document already filed. Sebastian nodded at each item, and with each nod he seemed to grow slightly larger in his chair. Then Arthur paused. He looked down at his folder, then up at Margaret. "There is one additional bequest," he said, "to Margaret Allen, widow of the late Thomas Allen." Sebastian's eyes moved to her now with a new kind of attention, sharper, slightly confused. Arthur reached across the table and gestured toward the brown envelope. "Mrs. Allen, you were asked to bring that envelope today. May I?" Margaret slid it toward him. Arthur opened it carefully and removed what was inside. He held it up just long enough for both of them to see it clearly before placing it flat on the table. It was a check, handwritten, signed by Edmund Croft himself, dated 3 weeks before his death. $10. The number sat there on the table between them like a small, strange stone. Sebastian stared at it for a moment. Then something happened in his face, a loosening around the mouth, a brightness in the eyes, and he laughed. It was not a small laugh. It rolled out of him fully, the laugh of a man who finds something genuinely, deeply funny and does not care who hears it. $10, he said. He looked at Margaret. He left you $10. Margaret did not look at him. She looked at the check. Her hands, resting in her lap, were very still. I am sorry, Sebastian said, waving his hand as though brushing something away. I am not trying to be rude. It is just... He laughed again, shorter this time. $10. What is that, a cup of coffee? 2 cups, maybe if you go somewhere cheap. Arthur said nothing. Sebastian shook his head, the smile still sitting loosely on his face. I always heard my father was sentimental. I did not realize he was this sentimental. He glanced at Arthur. Is that it? That is her bequest? We came all the way here for a $10 check. That is not all, Arthur said. His voice was quiet, completely level, but something in it made Sebastian stop smiling. Arthur's hand moved to the thin folder he had placed face down on the table when he first sat down, the one he had not opened yet, the one he had said nothing about. He turned it over. Margaret looked at it, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something shifted in her expression. Not surprise. She had known this moment was coming, but something older than surprise, something that looked, if you watched closely enough, almost like relief. Sebastian looked at the folder. Then he looked at Arthur. What is that? He asked. Arthur placed one hand flat on the cover of it, the way you place a hand on something before you open it and change the room. This, Arthur said, is the rest of your father's instructions. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room where everyone is breathing carefully, where every small sound, the hum of the air, the faint creak of Sebastian's chair as he shifted, the soft settle of Margaret's hands in her lap, become suddenly loud and significant. Arthur did not open the folder immediately. He was not a man who rushed the important moments. He had learned, across 7 decades of living and 3 of loitering, that the moments which mattered most deserved a breath of space before they were entered. He had also learned to read rooms. And this room, right now, was telling him everything he needed to know about both people sitting across from each other. Sebastian was leaning forward slightly. The easy confidence had not left his body entirely, but it had shifted. There was a new tension in his shoulders. The particular tension of a man who had believed he understood the shape of something and was now beginning to suspect the shape was different from what he thought. Margaret was still, the way still water is still, calm on the surface, but with everything, all the depth, all the history, all the cold, dark weight of it, moving slowly underneath. Arthur opened the folder. Inside were several documents, each separated by a thin strip of colored paper. He did not hand them across the table. He arranged them in front of him in a careful order, the order Edmund had specified, the order that told the story the way Edmund had wanted it told. The first document he lifted was a single page, handwritten like the check, in Edmund Croft's distinctive slanted script. Edmund had insisted on writing this part himself. Arthur had tried gently to suggest a typed version would be cleaner, more official. Edmund had looked at him with those quiet, serious eyes and said, "Some things need to be in your own hand." So they were. Arthur read it aloud. The letter was addressed to no one specifically. It began not with a name, but with a sentence that made Sebastian go very still. There is a debt I have carried for 40 years, and I will not leave this world without paying it. Arthur read slowly, giving each word its proper weight. 43 years ago, Edmund wrote, I was not the man you know today. I was 27 years old. I had recently lost everything in a failed business. My savings, my investors' money, the small company I had spent 4 years building. I was in a bad place, not just financially. I mean, I was in a dark place inside myself, the kind of dark that a young man can fall into when he has believed in something completely and watched it collapse completely, and does not yet know that collapse is not the end of the story. Sebastian's jaw moved slightly, but he said nothing. I was in the town of Harwell. Arthur continued reading. staying in a cheap room above a hardware store, trying to figure out what came next. I had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Not because I was trying to save money, because I had none left to save. Margaret's eyes were closed now. She knew this part of the story. She had lived beside it for most of her adult life. A woman found me sitting on the steps outside that hardware store at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. It was raining. I was not even trying to get out of the rain anymore. I had simply stopped caring about the rain. She did not ask me many questions. She sat beside me for a few minutes in the rain, and then she said, "Come inside." So I did. Arthur paused. He looked up briefly, not at Sebastian, not at Margaret, just into the middle of the room, the way a person looks when they are carrying something heavy and need 1 second to adjust their grip. Her name was Dorothy Allen. She was the wife of Thomas Allen, who ran a small repair shop 3 doors down from the hardware store. They had a young daughter, no savings to speak of, and a house that needed a new roof. They had nothing to spare, and they gave me everything they could. Sebastian's hand, which had been resting loosely on the table, was now flat against the surface, pressing down as though he needed something solid. Dorothy fed me for 11 days. Thomas found me temporary work at the repair shop. They gave me a dry place to sleep, and they did not once make me feel like a charity case or a burden. They treated me like a man who had fallen, not like a man who deserved to fall. That difference, Arthur read, is not a small thing. That difference is everything. When you are at the bottom and someone treats you like you still have dignity, they are not just feeding you. They are giving you back the ability to stand up. Arthur set the first page down. Sebastian was staring at it. "Dorothy," Sebastian said slowly, "that was your mother?" He looked at Margaret. "My mother-in-law," Margaret said quietly. "Thomas's mother. She passed 15 years ago." Sebastian looked back at Arthur. Arthur lifted the second document. This one was typed. Official. It bore the seal of a property registration office in the county of Harwell and the surrounding rural district. When I rebuilt my business, Edmund had written at the bottom of the first page in a final paragraph Arthur now read aloud. I tried to find Thomas and Dorothy to repay them. Thomas told me flatly that they wanted nothing. Dorothy said the same. Thomas died before I could find another way. Dorothy passed some years later, but the debt did not pass with them. A debt like that does not expire. It transfers. It waits. And I made a decision, quietly, legally, and with great care, that it would be honored. Arthur placed the typed document flat on the table and turned it so both Margaret and Sebastian could see it clearly. It was a property deed, a countryside estate in the Harwell district, 11 acres, registered under a private holding that Edmund had established 17 years ago. The holding had been maintained, the grounds kept, the property protected from sale or development through a preservation clause Edmund's legal team had spent considerable effort constructing. The estate had a name. It was called Allenfield. Edmund had named it himself. Sebastian stared at the deed for a long moment. Then he looked up at Arthur. "He named it after them," Sebastian said. His voice was different now. The loose, comfortable edge was entirely gone. "He did," Arthur said. "For 17 years. Yes. And he never told me." Arthur folded his hands again. "He told me he did not want it to become a conversation. He did not want the estate to be something your family discussed at dinner or something that was framed as generosity. He was very specific about that. He said that what Thomas and Dorothy did for him was not generosity. It was humanity, and the repayment of it was not charity. It was a debt. He did not want to treat it as anything other than what it was." Sebastian sat back in his chair, not with ease this time, with the slow, careful movement of someone who needs to sit back because the alternative is leaning forward and showing too much of what is happening inside them. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and removed a small photograph. She placed it on the table without a word. It was old. The colors faded to warm browns and yellows. A young woman and a young man standing in front of a repair shop, squinting slightly into the sun. Between them, barely visible, was a small girl with her hair in 2 uneven braids. "That is Dorothy," Margaret said. "And Thomas." The little one is my husband, when he was about 5. Sebastian looked at the photograph for a long time. My father never mentioned Harwell. He said finally, "Not once. In 34 years, I never heard him say that name." "No," Arthur said. He would not have. He felt the story was not his to tell freely. It belonged to the Allen family, as much as it did to him, and he did not believe he had the right to speak it publicly without their permission. So he kept it privately, and he honored it privately. Sebastian looked at Margaret. Something in his face was struggling. The way a face struggles when it is trying to accommodate a feeling it was not built to expect. "The $10, he said slowly. He was working it out as he spoke. The way a person works out of something they should have seen earlier. That was not an insult. "No," Arthur said. "It was symbolic. Edmund said it was the first thing he was able to repay them. The morning he left Harwell, Dorothy packed him food for the road, and Thomas pressed some money into his hand. $10. Edmund said it was the most significant $10 he ever held. He kept the original bill for 40 years. Arthur reached into the folder one final time and removed a small sealed plastic sleeve. Inside it, barely visible, was an old and carefully folded paper bill, soft with age. He wanted Mrs. Allen to have it back. Margaret's hands came up from her lap and covered her mouth. She did not make a sound, but her eyes filled, and one tear moved down her left cheek, and she did not wipe it away. Sebastian looked at the bill, at the deed, at the photograph, at Margaret, and for the first time since she had walked into the room, he looked at her the way you look at a person when you finally see them. Not furniture, not an inconvenience, not a punchline, a person with a history longer and more important than anything he had laughed at. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again. "I owe you an apology," he said. Margaret looked at him. Her eyes were still wet, but her expression was steady and quiet, and held something in it that Sebastian Croft, for all his money and all his confidence, recognized immediately as something he had very rarely been on the receiving end of: grace. She did not answer him yet. Arthur closed the folder and looked at them both. "There is one more thing," he said. "Edmund asked that I take Mrs. Allen to the estate today, in person. He wanted the handover done properly. He was very clear about that." He looked at Sebastian. "He also said that if you wished to come, you were welcome, that the choice was yours." Sebastian looked at his hands on the table, at the photograph, at the old $10 bill in its careful sleeve. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to come." The drive to Harwell took just under 2 hours. Arthur drove his own car, steady and unhurried, the way he did everything. Margaret sat in the passenger seat. Sebastian followed behind in his own vehicle, alone, which was perhaps the right arrangement. Some things need to be thought about in private before they can be faced properly in public. And Sebastian Croft had a great deal to think about on that drive through the gray morning countryside. Margaret watched the landscape change through the window. The city fell away behind them in layers. First the tall buildings, then the low ones, then the wide roads narrowing to smaller ones, then the smaller ones giving way to the kind of roads that win between old trees and low stone walls and fields that have been fields for longer than anyone can remember. She had grown up not far from Harwell. She knew this landscape the way you know the face of someone you have loved for a long time. Every hill and bend was familiar, not because she had memorized it, but because it lived somewhere inside her. She held the plastic sleeve in her lap, the entire drive, the old $10 bill inside it. She did not look at it. She did not need to. She could feel it. Arthur did not talk much on the drive, which she appreciated. He put on a radio station that played quiet, instrumental music, and he drove, and she sat, and the countryside moved past them, and it was enough. She thought about Thomas, her husband, not his father, but the man she had married, the quiet and steady man who had carried his family's story gently and never used it to make himself seem more than he was. He had told her about Edmund once, only once, shortly after they were married. He had said, "There's a man out there who owes my parents everything, and they would be horrified to hear me say that. So I never will again." And he had not. Thomas had died 4 years ago. A heart that had simply worked as long and as hard as it could, and then stopped. She had sat beside his bed and held his hand and thought about all the things a life contains that no one else ever fully sees. Edmund had died 6 weeks after Thomas. She had read it in the paper. 3 weeks after Edmund's death, Arthur Pennington had called her. She had not been entirely surprised. She had not known about this date. She had not known about the deed or the name or the 17 years of careful, quiet preparation. But she had known Edmund Croft was not a man who forgot. Thomas had told her that too. In the same conversation, the only time he had spoken of it, he said, "Whatever else that man becomes, he will not forget. That is not who he is." Thomas had been right. She pressed her fingers lightly against the plastic sleeve and looked out at the fields going past, and thought, "You were right, my love. You were right about him." Arthur turned off the main road onto a narrow lane, and the lane curved gently upward through a corridor of old oak trees, whose bare branches crossed overhead like the arched ceiling of a very old church. The light came through them in thin, pale strips. The tires moved quietly over the packed earth. Then the trees opened up, and there it was. The estate sat at the top of a soft rise in the land, framed on either side by open fields that rolled away toward a distant tree line. The house itself was not enormous. It was not a mansion built to impress. It was a kind of house that had been built to last. Stone walls, a slate roof, wide windows that caught whatever light was available and held it. There was a low garden wall along the front, and beyond it, grounds that had been kept carefully, the grass trimmed, the paths clear. Everything tended to the same quiet devotion that Edmund had brought to the dead itself. Above the gate, set into the stone, were 2 words, Allenfield. Margaret looked at them for a long moment from the car. She thought about Dorothy, who had sat down in the rain beside a young man she did not know and said, "Come inside." Dorothy, who had never once spoken of it as anything remarkable, who had said, if anyone asked, that it was simply what you did for a person who needed it. Dorothy, who had mended things, fed people, kept a house that was always slightly too cold in winter and always filled with the smell of something cooking, who had pressed Thomas's school shirts every morning of his childhood without complaint and had gone to her grave without knowing that the young man she had sheltered for 11 rainy days had spent 40 years trying to figure out how to say thank you in a way that would be worthy of what she had done. She had not known, but Edmund had made sure that the name above the gate would say what he had not been able to say to her face. She got out of the car. The air outside was cold and clean and smelled of earth and coming rain. Arthur came around and stood beside her. A moment later, the sound of the second car on the lane, and Sebastian pulled up behind them and got out slowly. He stood and looked at the house, at the name above the gate. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Allenfield." "Yes," Arthur said. "He never told me." Sebastian said it not with anger this time, just with the plain, stripped sound of a man confronting something true. He built this, kept this, named it, maintained it for 17 years, and he never said a word to me. He did not want it to be about him, Margaret said. Sebastian looked at her. It was the most she had said directly to him since the conference room, and her voice was gentle when she said it, not hard, not pointed, just true. He felt at the moment he spoke about it. It would become his story, she continued, his generosity, his gesture, and it was not. It was a debt. It belonged to Dorothy and Thomas. He was very careful about the difference. Sebastian was quiet. The wind moved across the open fields and pushed lightly against them, and somewhere behind the house a bird called once and went still. "He was a better man than I knew," Sebastian said. "He was a complicated man," Margaret said carefully. "But, yes, in this, he was very good." Sebastian turned to face her fully then. He was not lounging. He was not performing. The ease and the carelessness and the laughter from the conference room were gone entirely, and what was left underneath was younger looking, uncertain, more human. "I laughed at you," he said, "this morning, when I saw the check." He stopped. "I want you to understand that I am not going to try to explain that away or make it smaller than it was. I knew nothing about you, nothing about your family, nothing about what you meant to my father, and I laughed at you in front of a lawyer, and I made you feel like nothing. I am sorry, That is all I can say. I am genuinely sorry." Margaret looked at him for a moment. She studied his face the way she had studied Dorothy's face in that old photograph 100 times over the years, looking for the thing underneath the surface. She found it. "Your father sat on wet steps in the rain," she said, "and a woman who had nothing sat down beside him anyway. He never forgot that. I think perhaps you will not forget this morning either, and I think that is enough." Sebastian's jaw moved. He pressed his lips together and nodded once, and looked away toward the fields, and Margaret allowed him that moment of looking away without comment. Arthur stepped forward and produced a key from his coat pocket. Old iron, attached to a simple ring. Edmund had kept it himself for 17 years. He held it out to Margaret. She took it. It was heavier than she expected, or perhaps it only felt that way because of what it carried. She walked to the gate and fitted the key into the old iron lock, and it turned with the deep, solid sound of a mechanism that has been well maintained and well made and is simply doing what was built to do. The gate swung inward. Margaret Allen walked through it. She walked up the stone path toward the front door of Allenfield, and her footsteps were quiet and unhurried, and the pale morning light fell across the garden wall and the slate roof and the 2 words above the gate, and it caught the worn polish of her shoes and made them shine. Behind her, Arthur Pennington folded his hands and watched her go. 31 years of carrying Edmund's secrets and honoring Edmund's promises, and this was the last one, the most important one. He felt the particular quiet that comes at the end of a long obligation honored fully. It was not a loud feeling. It did not call attention to itself. It settled. Sebastian stood at the gate and watched Margaret reach the front door. She put her hand on the door and paused there for a moment with her back to them, and he understood, without being told, that this pause was private, that she was saying something inside herself that was not for him or Arthur or anyone still living. Then she opened the door and went inside. Sebastian stayed at the gate for a long time after she disappeared. He was looking at the name in the stone. He was thinking about 11 rainy days in a town he had never heard of, about a woman who sat down beside a stranger, about a $10 bill kept in a drawer for 40 years, about a son who had laughed at something he did not understand. He thought about who his father had been and who he himself was, and the considerable distance between those 2 things, and what it might take to close it. He did not have the answer yet, but for the first time in a long time, he was asking the question, and that, as any honest person will tell you, is always where the real story begins.